They called my wedding a disgrace. Imagine that. The most important day of my life, the moment I thought my family would finally stand beside me, and instead, empty chairs, whispers behind closed doors, and a cruel message. We won't come. This wedding is a shame to our family. While I walked down the aisle alone, my parents and my so-called golden sister were smiling on a yacht, raising glasses of champagne as if my pain was nothing but entertainment. I thought that would break me forever. But life has a strange way of turning. Because that same day, while they were toasting my humiliation, the cameras turned on me, broadcast live across national television, as I said my vows to the man they never believed I could deserve. Not just any man, but the billionaire CEO of a company worth $5 billion. Suddenly, their silence shattered. Their phones blew up. Their pride cracked in half. Hours later, my family group chat lit up with one desperate line from my mother. "Where are you?" And do you know what I sent back? Not a word. Not an explanation. Just a single ha-ha reaction. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't screaming or fighting, it's letting the truth speak for itself, loud and clear, where the whole world can see it. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll hear everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the shocking twists my parents never saw coming. And finally, the moment that turned my disgrace into their greatest regret. Trust me, you don't want to miss how it all unfolds. Evelyn Carter was 32 years old, an interior architect whose designs had begun to draw notice in Seattle's professional circles. She had built a quiet, disciplined life marked by long hours, meticulous drawings, and an unshakable determination to succeed without help. Tonight was meant to be her reward, the culmination of years of hard work and the beginning of a new chapter with the man she loved. Yet as the church bells chimed, Evelyn realized the one thing she had always longed for, the presence and blessing of her family, was not going to be hers. The echo of her mother's dismissive words and her father's stern condemnation followed her like a shadow as she took her first step into the chapel. The sanctuary glowed with soft candlelight, a breathtaking sight to anyone entering for the first time. White roses lined the pews and golden ribbons draped gracefully across the aisle. Evelyn's gown shimmered with delicate embroidery, each thread reflecting the light in tiny flashes, as though even the dress wanted to celebrate her. She paused at the threshold, drawing in a breath, as the music swelled her heart, pounding against the tight bodice of silk and lace. For a fleeting second, she imagined the rows of benches filled with smiling faces, her mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, her father standing tall with quiet pride, her younger sister clapping with delight. It was the picture she had carried in her heart since she was a little girl, the image that had kept her warm on lonely nights. But when her eyes scanned the pews, all she saw was absence. The seats reserved for her family, polished and marked with delicate name cards, sat untouched. Their emptiness loomed larger than the ornate stained glass windows, larger than the grandeur of the space itself. A small knot of her closest friends stood scattered near the front, their whispers of encouragement carrying faintly over the organ's melody. They smiled and gestured for her to come forward to take her rightful place, but their kindness only deepened the hollow ache inside her. The sound of her shoes against the marble floor echoed too loudly in the cavernous silence, every step a reminder of who was not there. Light streamed through the tall windows, casting narrow shafts of color onto the aisle hues of ruby and sapphire stretching across her path. They should have been beautiful, a painter's dream, but to Evelyn they only emphasized the stillness of the room. In the interplay of shadow and brightness, she saw her isolation reflected back at her. Even the holy space seemed to stand as a witness to her abandonment, as though heaven itself were asking why the people who should have loved her most had chosen not to appear. She tightened her grip on the bouquet of white lilies and pale roses, the petals trembling with the faintest shake of her hand. She forced her lips into a smile, one she had practiced in the mirror countless times before, the kind of smile meant to reassure others that all was well. But behind the veil, her eyes betrayed her. They glistened with unshed tears, shimmering with a pain she could not conceal. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake as a child, whispering prayers that one day she would be cherished equally, that her milestones would matter just as much as anyone else's. Tonight should have been the proof of those prayers. Instead, it was the cruel confirmation of her invisibility. The music shifted, signaling her cue to move forward. Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle, but she willed herself on step by deliberate step. Her friends' faces blurred at the edges of her vision as she focused on the long stretch of aisle ahead. She imagined for a heartbeat that the figures she longed to see were waiting there. Her father straightening his tie, her mother brushing invisible dust from her dress, her sister with a gleam of pride in her eyes. The vision faded almost as soon as it formed, leaving only the cold truth. They were not here. They had chosen not to witness her joy. A memory surged, unbidden, sharp and cruel in its timing. A younger Evelyn, perhaps 10 or 11, spinning in front of her bedroom mirror while wearing a dress she had fashioned from scraps of old fabric. She had whispered then to her reflection, promising herself that when her wedding day came, her family would finally look at her, the way they looked at her sister, with adoration, with pride, with love. She had carried that promise through years of small slights and overlooked achievements, a fragile hope that someday the balance would tilt in her favor. Standing in the chapel now, she felt the weight of that broken promise pressing against her chest. Still, Evelyn lifted her chin. She would not falter, not here, not now. The bouquet quivered in her hands, but her back remained straight as she advanced toward the altar. Each step was both a march of resolve and a surrender to grief. She told herself she could endure this moment, that she could carve out her own strength even as her heart cracked. Her friends rose quietly in support, the sound of their movement filling the silence with something human, something loyal. Their presence mattered, but it could not replace the gaping wound carved by the absence of those who should have been in the front row. At last she reached the end of the aisle where Daniel stood waiting. His eyes softened when they met hers, offering comfort without words. Evelyn drew in a deep breath, steadying her trembling shoulders. She had come this far, and she would go further still. The chapel might be empty of her family, but she would not let it be empty of her dignity. Her wedding day had begun in silence and shadows, but she knew it would not end there. What she could not yet know was that this emptiness, this wound carved so mercilessly, would soon become the very stage on which everything changed. The silence of the chapel lingered in Evelyn's chest long after she had reached the altar, but her mind began to drift backward, back to the words that had made this emptiness inevitable. She could still hear the sound of her father's voice from the week before, clipped and unyielding, spoken with the authority of a man who had never allowed his decisions to be questioned. The call had come in the evening while she was adjusting details of the seating chart, still hopeful that despite the tension of recent months, her family would arrive on her wedding day. She remembered the static on the line, then Robert Carter clearing his throat, as if preparing for a courtroom verdict rather than a conversation with his daughter. He did not offer pleasantries, did not ask how she was feeling. Instead, he said in a tone that brooked no reply, "This wedding is a disgrace to our family." The words had fallen with the weight of a gavel. Evelyn had clutched the phone tighter, her pulse racing as she searched for some sign that he might soften, that perhaps he had spoken in anger, he would quickly retract. But Robert was not a man who retracted. He had spent his life clinging to an image of perfection, and in his mind her decision to marry without their blessing was a stain on that image. He spoke of reputation, of how people would talk, how neighbors and colleagues would whisper about the Carter family attending a ceremony that was beneath their standard. Evelyn had tried to interject to explain that what mattered was the love she had found, the commitment she was about to make, but he cut her off with the same sharpness that had silenced her since childhood. "We will not be there," he declared. "Better absent than associated with shame." Her mother's voice entered next, softer in tone, but no less crushing in its effect. Margaret Carter had always been the keeper of appearances, her days filled with garden clubs, charity luncheons, and an unspoken hierarchy of who was worthy of admiration. Evelyn had hoped foolishly, perhaps, that her mother would defend her, that Margaret's instinct for preserving family unity might override Robert's rigidity. Instead, Margaret sighed a sound heavy with judgment rather than sympathy. "Your father is right," she said, "and you should have thought about the consequences before rushing into this. A wedding is not only about two people, it is about what it says to the world. You are marrying the wrong man in the wrong way, and we cannot attach our name to it." The phrase "attach our name" echoed in Evelyn's ear long after the call ended, as though her marriage were nothing more than a business contract they refused to endorse. She had hung up feeling smaller than she had in years, the little girl once again told she had failed to meet expectations she never agreed to. The final blow came not by phone, but by text, delivered in the clipped and dismissive style that her younger sister had perfected. Sophia, the golden child, the daughter who could do no wrong, had not even bothered to disguise her disdain. The message arrived just as Evelyn was finishing a late-night revision to the floral arrangements. The screen lit up with a single sentence that seemed to sneer as she read it. "You don't deserve a grand wedding. No explanation, no apology, not even a pretense of love." Just cold words from the sister who had been showered with accolades and attention since the cradle, the sister who had always looked down at Evelyn from a pedestal built by their parents. It was not just rejection. It was erasure. Sophia was declaring in no uncertain terms that Evelyn's happiness was illegitimate, unworthy of celebration. Evelyn remembered sitting in her apartment after that barrage, the silence pressing against her as heavily as the walls themselves. She stared at the glow of her phone, her hands trembling, reading the messages again and again as though repetition might dull their sting. She considered calling Daniel, confessing the depth of her despair, but she stopped herself. He already knew her family disapproved, but he did not need to see how their scorn still cut her to the bone. This was her wound to carry. She set the phone aside, lifted her chin, and whispered to her reflection in the darkened window, "I will still walk down that aisle. With or without them, I will walk." The days that followed were filled with quiet determination. She moved through the final preparations with mechanical precision, selecting the music, arranging the flowers, double-checking the seating chart that now bore empty spaces where her family's names had once been written. Every detail completed was an act of defiance, a refusal to allow their absence to cancel her day. She did not weep in front of her friends, though they saw the shadows in her eyes. She smiled when she had to clench her jaw when she was alone, and told herself over and over that dignity could survive even without approval. By the time the wedding day arrived, Evelyn had accepted the truth. Her father's words, her mother's excuses, her sister's scorn, they would echo in her heart for years to come, but they would not prevent her from standing before the altar. As she entered the chapel and saw those empty seats, she already knew why they were vacant. It was not an accident, not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice born of pride and prejudice, and she carried that knowledge with her like a stone in her chest. The absence hurt, but the act of proceeding hurt less than surrender would have. And so she held her bouquet tighter, forced her smile, and walked forward wounded, but unbroken. In that moment, even as sorrow pressed down upon her, she made a silent vow she would not let their verdict define the rest of her story. The voices from that last conversation with her parents still echoed faintly in Evelyn's mind as she found herself seated in a quiet side room of the chapel. The ceremony had paused briefly, guests mingling or stepping outside for air, and she had a moment alone. The hush of the place pressed on her ears, a silence that made her acutely aware of every thought, every memory. She set her bouquet gently on the table beside her and pulled her phone from her small clutch, not with any particular purpose, but out of habit, the way one does when solitude feels too sharp. She thought perhaps a friend had sent her a kind word or one of her colleagues had left a note of encouragement. Instead, the screen illuminated with a crueler truth than even her father's words had delivered. There at the top of her social feed was an image so polished it could have been taken for a magazine spread. Her parents stood on the deck of a gleaming yacht, Glasses of champagne raised high while fireworks burst in radiant streams across the night sky behind them. Her mother, in a dress of deep emerald satin, laughed as though she had not a care in the world. Her father's hand rested proudly on Sophia's shoulder, his posture that of a man who had triumphed, not one who had abandoned his eldest daughter's wedding. Sophia herself glowed in the center of the frame, her smile practiced, her hair styled in golden curls that caught the light of the sparklers dancing around her. Behind them, other guests mingled, each one dressed in finery, their joy captured mid-laughter. The caption, written in Margaret's elegant style, read, "Celebrating life's true milestones." It did not mention Evelyn. It did not mention the wedding that should have bound the family together. It celebrated instead the occasion of their own choosing, a pointed exclusion, wrapped in glamour. Evelyn stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. The contrast struck her with a ferocity she could not have anticipated. The hush of the chapel around her, the rows of vacant seats, the faint echo of her own footsteps along the aisle, all of it collided in her mind with the sparkle of the fireworks and the shimmer of the sea beneath that yacht. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. Here she sat in a space consecrated for vows and beginnings, her family's absence marking her every step, while they reveled in excess, the very picture of joy, as though her day were nothing more than a footnote in their lives. It was not just absence, it was a public declaration that they had chosen something else, someone else over her. Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the phone knuckles, whitening under the strain. She tried to steady herself, but her thumb scrolled almost against her will, revealing more pictures. Sophia leaning against the railing, a glass of red wine catching the reflection of the moon. Robert and Margaret laughing with friends, the wind tousling Robert's hair in a rare moment of ease. The yacht's lights casting golden glimmers on the waves as though the sea itself had bent to their celebration. It was everything Evelyn had dreamed her wedding might be for her, a gathering of love, laughter, and family. But here, it was repurposed to exclude her entirely. Each new image pierced deeper, a series of small daggers lodged where her heart should have been swelling with joy. The sting of betrayal rose hot in her eyes, and for a moment she let the tears fall. They slid down her cheeks, unchecked, blurring the screen before her. But almost as soon as she felt them, she swiped them away, quick and decisive, unwilling to grant the photographs the satisfaction of her visible sorrow. She drew in a sharp breath, the kind that steadies a trembling body, and forced her hands to still. She would not crumble in this room, not while the echo of organ music still lingered in the air. She pressed the phone to her chest for a long moment, as though the hard glass might anchor her, then set it carefully back in her clutch. Her eyes lifted to the small window high on the chapel wall. Through it, she could just make out a slice of sky, pale blue, edging toward dusk. For a fleeting instant, she imagined that the fireworks might be visible from here, faint streaks of color against the horizon, carrying her family's laughter across the water to mock her. She shuddered, then pulled herself upright, smoothing the silk of her gown. The bitterness of the vision burned through her, but beneath it was a core of steel. The images had wounded her, yes, but they had also clarified something she had always sensed: she would never be enough for them. No effort, no achievement, no act of devotion could command their loyalty if it clashed with their vanity. She wiped the last trace of tears from her cheeks, careful not to smudge her makeup. Her reflection in the mirror across the room looked almost composed again, though her eyes carried a weight no powder or veil could conceal. She drew another breath, slow and deliberate, and whispered to herself, words that felt both fragile and powerful. "I will finish this day. With or without them, I will finish it." She picked up her bouquet once more, her fingers steady now, though the petals quivered faintly as if sharing her burden. The laughter from the yacht might echo in her memory, but it would not define the woman who walked back into that chapel. She rose, squared her shoulders, and prepared to step once more into the silence, carrying with her the knowledge of their betrayal, but also the beginnings of a resolve they would one day regret underestimating. Evelyn re-entered the chapel with her bouquet in hand, her eyes still carrying the shadow of what she had seen on her phone, though her face bore no outward trace. The air was hushed again, guests whispering softly as the organ resumed its gentle notes. She drew a long breath, steadying herself as she walked the final steps toward the altar. Daniel turned to her with a smile meant to calm her, and for a moment she allowed herself to rest in the warmth of his gaze. But as the officiant raised his hand to signal the beginning of the vows, the silence of the absent rose pressed against her once more, reminding her of who was missing and why. The moment she had imagined as a child was not the moment she was about to live, and she would have to summon strength from the hollow ache inside her. When it came time to speak, Evelyn's voice wavered at first. The words trembled as they left her lips, the syllables fragile under the weight of emotion. Yet as she pressed forward, her tone grew steadier, anchored by her determination not to falter. Her vows spoke of resilience of love that endures storms of choosing not only a partner, but also a life built on trust and devotion. She did not embellish with grand gestures or rehearsed phrases. Instead, she offered simple truths shaped by her own hard years. Each word carried the resonance of someone who had known what it was to be unseen, and who had chosen nonetheless to stand here and be heard. Though her voice caught more than once, she did not pause long enough for silence to break her. She lifted her chin, forced breath into her lungs, and pressed the words into existence, each one a testament to the fact that she would not be silenced. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch warm and certain. His thumb brushed over her knuckles in small, reassuring circles, a silent promise that he stood beside her in this moment of fragility. Evelyn's heart lifted at the comfort, but beneath it ran a current of awareness. His presence could not fill the absence that stretched across the rows of empty seats. He could love her fully, and he did, yet even his devotion could not undo decades of yearning for acknowledgement that had never come. The emptiness was its own entity, a shadow at her side, and she knew it would follow her down this aisle, no matter how tightly Daniel held her hand. Still, she tightened her grip on him in return, grateful for the strength he offered, even if it could not mend what had been broken. As her vows drew to a close, a ripple of applause rose from the small cluster of friends who had gathered in the front pews. Their clapping was hesitant at first, as though they were unsure if it was proper, but soon it grew stronger, filling the air with a warmth the chapel had not yet known that day. A friend of hers, a woman from college who had seen Evelyn's long nights of study and sacrifice, stood with tears in her eyes, clapping louder than the rest. Another friend, a colleague from her firm, added his voice with a soft cheer. Their support was genuine, their affection palpable, and for a moment Evelyn felt something close to belonging. The sound did not erase the stillness of the other pews, but it softened the edges of her solitude. She let herself smile faintly, a smile that carried gratitude as much as sorrow. Her eyes, almost against her will, drifted to the section of the chapel reserved for family. The pews were empty still, the polished wood gleaming under the filtered light, untouched by human presence. For an instant, her imagination filled them. She pictured her father seated with arms folded, stern, but present. Her mother dabbing tears of pride from her eyes, her sister leaning forward with a grin. The image was so vivid she could almost believe it was real, and for a heartbeat her chest ached with the sweetness of it. But then the vision dissolved, leaving only the bare benches and the truth she could not escape. They were not here. They had chosen not to be here. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering within herself words she had never dared to say aloud. "I do not need them." The officiant's voice carried on, leading Daniel through his vows, the cadence steady and strong. Evelyn listened, her gaze steady now, the flicker of earlier tears gone from her eyes. Daniel's words wrapped around her like a cloak, reminding her that even in absence there could be presence, even in rejection there could be love. Yet she knew the true strength she would carry from this day would not be borrowed from him or anyone else. It would be her own, drawn from the quiet defiance that had kept her standing when others would have crumbled. The chapel remained marked by emptiness, but Evelyn herself was not empty. She was bruised, she was scarred, but she was also unbroken. When the officiant declared their vows complete, Evelyn allowed herself a final glance toward the vacant rows. Instead of letting her heart break anew, she felt a surprising surge of resolve. The absence was real, but so was her choice to stand in spite of it. She turned back to Daniel, her lips curving into a faint but genuine smile. The applause of her friends swelled again, a gentle chorus rising to meet her. And in that moment, even with her family's silence echoing in the empty pews, Evelyn claimed the truth for herself. She did not need them to make her whole. The sound of applause still lingered faintly in the chapel when Evelyn lowered her bouquet, her vows complete. She had steadied herself, pushed through the hollow ache of the empty rose, and declared her commitment with a trembling voice that grew stronger with each word. Daniel's vows had followed his tone, confident, his devotion clear, and together they had sealed their promise before the small circle of friends who had chosen to stand by them. For a moment, Evelyn allowed herself to believe the worst had passed, that the emptiness of her family's absence would remain the only shadow over this day. But as she turned her head slightly, catching sight of movement at the back of the sanctuary, a ripple of unease stirred within her. The heavy doors opened quietly, and instead of late-arriving guests, Evelyn saw men and women carrying cameras, microphones, and the unmistakable presence of the press. A cameraman adjusted his lens with practiced precision, the red light blinking alive. Another raised a boom microphone above the pews. A woman with a press badge whispered into her headset, nodding as though receiving instructions. Evelyn's breath caught. This was not a private photographer or a family friend capturing keepsakes. This was media professionals whose very presence seemed at odds with the intimate vows she had just spoken. The quiet sanctity of the chapel shifted suddenly, the air charged with a strange new energy. The faint hum of machinery replaced the hush of prayer. Her first instinct was panic. Heat flushed across her cheeks as she clutched her bouquet tighter. This was her wedding, not a stage for strangers. She turned quickly toward Daniel, her veil rustling with the sharpness of her movement. Her eyes searched his face for answers, for any sign that he too was caught off guard. Instead, she found him watching her with a calm expression, his lips curved in a faint smile that seemed almost deliberate, as though he had expected this all along. She leaned toward him, her voice low but urgent. "Daniel, what is this? Why are they here?" For a beat, her question hung unanswered, swallowed by the quiet buzz of the camera equipment being positioned. Daniel did not flinch. He squeezed her hand, meeting her anxious gaze with steady eyes. His smile did not falter as he spoke softly, a voice pitched just for her. "You deserve to be seen, Evelyn." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight she could not immediately grasp. They were not an explanation, not in the way she wanted, but they were spoken with such certainty that for a moment she felt her resistance falter. His tone was not apologetic. It was resolute, as though he believed without question that this intrusion was not a violation, but a gift. Still, Evelyn's mind swirled with unease. She had lived her life in shadows, overlooked by the very people who should have lifted her up. The thought of strangers now shining a light on her most vulnerable moment was unsettling, even frightening. She glanced back at the journalists, her heart pounding. One camera shifted focus, the lens narrowing until she could feel it on her face, as intimate and invasive as a touch. The light from a flash burst suddenly, dazzling her eyes, turning the white of her gown into a blazing mirror. The burst of brightness burned across her vision, leaving her momentarily blinded. When her sight cleared, she found herself staring back into that unblinking eye of the camera, and the strange realization settled over her. This was deliberate. This was orchestrated. Daniel had not been surprised by their arrival. He had invited it. Her chest tightened as questions crowded her mind. What did he mean by her being deserving to be seen? Who exactly did he want her to be seen by? Was this about sharing their love with the world? Or was there something more, something she had yet to uncover? The words she had spoken in her vows still rang in her ears, words of devotion and endurance, and now she wondered if they were already being broadcast beyond these walls, carried to ears she had never intended to hear them. She thought of her parents, her sister, the very people who had called her wedding a disgrace. Were they watching? Was this Daniel's quiet answer to their scorn? Her pulse quickened, her mind reeling, but she held herself still. She could not let her guests see her confusion, not when she had fought so hard to maintain dignity in the face of absence. She nodded faintly to Daniel, though her heart hammered with uncertainty. The cameras moved closer, the whir of their equipment filling the air like the sound of wings descending. Another flash seared across her vision, catching her wide eyes and parted lips. For the briefest moment, Evelyn felt suspended between two worlds, the one where she was the forgotten daughter, and the one where she was suddenly illuminated under lights brighter than she had ever known. The ceremony resumed around her, but Evelyn scarcely heard the words of the officiant. She stood in place, hand entwined with Daniel's, her thoughts spinning in restless circles. A seed of suspicion had been planted deep within her. Something larger was unfolding, something Daniel had chosen not to tell her until this moment. She could not yet name it, could not yet see its full shape, but she felt its presence looming just beyond her understanding. The world was no longer contained within these chapel walls. With each flash of the cameras, with each sweep of the lens, her life was being pulled into a broader stage. She held herself steady, eyes forward, even as the light from another burst illuminated her face. The glow caught her features, freezing her expression of wonder and unease for all to see. And in that instant, Evelyn knew that nothing about this day would remain confined to the silence she had once feared. It was becoming something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to grasp but could no longer escape. That night, after the last of the guests had gone, and the silence of her apartment had settled around her like a heavy cloak, Evelyn sank into the corner of her couch, still dressed in her gown. She had not yet found the strength to change, as though removing the dress would somehow lessen the meaning of what she had endured. The bouquet rested on the coffee table, petals beginning to curl at the edges. She reached for the remote with fingers that felt strangely detached from her body, pressing the power button more from instinct than intent. The screen flickered to life, and what she saw made her breath catch. Her own face filled the television framed by her veil and lit by the blinding flash she remembered from earlier. The caption running beneath it read, "Seattle wedding stuns viewers nationwide." Her heart began to race as the broadcast unfolded. The camera captured her walking down the aisle, her vows spoken in a trembling voice, Daniel's steady hand clasping hers. The anchor's voice narrated with practiced drama, explaining to viewers that this was no ordinary ceremony. Evelyn leaned forward, her breath shallow, unable to look away, as the program cut to footage of Daniel slipping the ring onto her finger. Then came the revelation delivered with the weight of breaking news. Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Technologies, a company valued at over $5 billion, exchanged vows today in a private ceremony here in Seattle. For years he has remained intensely private about his personal life, but tonight the world has seen the woman who now shares his name. Evelyn's body went rigid. The name sounded almost foreign, spoken aloud in that context, paired with numbers that seemed too large to be real. She stared at the screen, her mind struggling to catch up with the words. $5 billion, CEO, national broadcast. She turned toward the quiet room as though expecting someone to confirm it for her, but of course no one was there. Daniel had told her little about his wealth, downplaying his work whenever she asked, speaking more often of the projects he admired than of his own fortune. She had known he was successful, but never in her wildest imaginings had she placed him among the ranks of men whose faces graced financial magazines. A dizzying mix of pride and shock coursed through her. Pride because the world now knew the man she loved had chosen her. Shock because he had never spoken the truth in such stark terms. A question rose hot in her chest. Why had he not told her before? Why let her discover like this through the cold voice of a television anchor? Her gaze stayed fixed on the screen, where clips of the ceremony played in slow motion. She saw herself from angles she had not noticed in the moment, her smile trembling yet steady, her eyes shining under the vaulted ceiling. She saw Daniel's confident posture, the ease with which he carried himself, even under the glare of cameras. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale, the forgotten daughter marrying into a life of unimaginable wealth and power. But Evelyn knew the truth was more complicated. For her, the day had been marked not by glamour, but by absence, by empty pews that no amount of money or fame could fill. She drew her knees to her chest, hugging herself tightly as the screen continued to blaze. In another part of the city, the broadcast reached the Carter household. Robert sat in his leather chair, a glass of red wine in hand, the evening quiet until the words from the television cut through like a blade. He had not expected to see his daughter's wedding splashed across national news, nor had he imagined that the man he had dismissed as unworthy was in fact the head of a corporation worth billions. As the anchor spoke Daniel's name and wealth, Robert's grip faltered. The stem of the wine glass slipped between his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Deep red spilled across the carpet like a stain spreading quickly. His jaw tightened, his breath sharp, his authority suddenly hollow. Margaret sat beside him, her posture rigid, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. The screen showed Evelyn's face again, radiant under her veil, the camera's flash turning her into a vision of poise. Margaret's own face drained of color. She had spent years perfecting her family's social standing, boasting of Sophia's triumphs, curating every detail of their public image. And now, here was Evelyn, the daughter she had deemed unworthy, unveiled to the entire nation as the bride of a billionaire. Margaret could not move, could not breathe. The foundation of her judgments trembled beneath her. Sophia, lounging on the couch with a phone in hand, had been scrolling through messages from friends when the announcement reached her ears. She looked up, eyes narrowing, the smile fading from her lips. The screen displayed her sister glowing in white, standing beside a man the world now praised as one of the most powerful figures in the country. For a moment, Sophia's body went still, her fingers tightening around her phone. A flush crept across her cheeks, not of pride, but of envy, raw and searing. She had been the star, the golden child, the one paraded at every recital and banquet. Now, in an instant, the spotlight had shifted, and the entire nation had witnessed it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her throat tight with disbelief. Back in her apartment, Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth as the segment continued, the words echoing in her ears long after they had been spoken. She could not tear her eyes away, even as her thoughts churned. Daniel had chosen this. He had invited the cameras, had orchestrated the reveal, had believed it was what she deserved. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the world needed to see her, to know her worth after a lifetime of being dismissed. Yet in the quiet of her living room, Evelyn could not shake the ache of not knowing, the sense that she had been thrust into a story she had not agreed to write. Pride and bewilderment twisted together, leaving her breathless. She whispered his name once softly, as though it might summon him, but the only response was the steady hum of the broadcast. The television continued to glow in the quiet of Evelyn's apartment, replaying fragments of her wedding, as if the day belonged not only to her, but to an entire nation now watching. She sat motionless, still processing the revelation of Daniel's identity and the weight of what it meant. Her phone, resting on the cushion beside her, began to vibrate with an urgency that broke the stillness. At first she ignored it, unwilling to let the outside world intrude again. But the buzzing grew persistent, insistent, until she reached for it. The screen lit up, and there it was, the family group chat alive in a way it had never been when she needed it most. Messages flooded in so quickly she could barely read them before new ones appeared. Her father's words stood out first, blunt and demanding as ever. "Evelyn, where are you? We need to talk. This has gone too far." His tone carried the same authority he had wielded her entire life, as though even now he expected her to obey, to explain herself. Before she could form a thought, another message appeared, this time from her mother. Margaret's words dripped with equal parts accusation and bewilderment. "Why didn't you tell us who Daniel really was? How could you hide something like this from your own family?" The question stung, though not in the way Margaret intended. Evelyn had never hidden Daniel from them. They had simply never asked, too busy dismissing her choices to consider that she might have built a life worth noticing. The chat continued to ping, her parents exchanging panicked lines as though scrambling to regain control of a story they had so casually abandoned. Robert, again. "You should have come to us first. We could have guided you." Margaret. "People are already talking. Do you realize what this means for us?" Their words revealed their true concern, not about Evelyn's happiness or well-being, but about their own place in the social hierarchy. It was not her joy they cared about. It was their pride, their image, their desperate need to rewrite themselves back into a narrative they had chosen to leave. Evelyn scrolled further, half expecting Sophia to have joined in. But her sister's name remained silent in the thread, her presence marked only by the small icon that showed she had seen every message. That silence said more than words could. Sophia, who had always been quick with a cutting remark, now had nothing to offer. Evelyn could picture her phone in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. Envy flickering in her eyes as she watched the world crown her sister with the attention she herself had always been given. For once, Sophia was not the star. She was the spectator forced to watch her older sister step into a light brighter than any spotlight a piano recital could provide. The phone buzzed again, Robert's impatience breaking through. "Answer us, Evelyn." Margaret followed almost immediately. "Where are you? We need to see you now." Evelyn stared at the screen, her breath steadying as she weighed her response. For years she had longed for their messages, for a sign that they cared, and now when they finally filled her phone, it was not love they offered but fear, not warmth but panic. She could have typed a paragraph, could have unleashed years of hurt into a few blistering sentences. She could have explained that they never bothered to look closely enough to see Daniel for who he was, that their absence from her wedding spoke louder than their sudden desperation. Instead, she let her thumb hover over the screen for a moment, then tapped once simply and decisively. A single reaction appeared under her father's demand, her mother's accusations, a laughing emoji. She set the phone down on the table, the glow of the screen fading as the chat erupted again, with fresh demands, her parents bewildered by the silence she had chosen. Evelyn leaned back against the couch, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It was not a smile of cruelty, but of release, a recognition that for the first time she was not scrambling for their approval. She had given them nothing, not even words, only the echo of her amusement. The simple gesture carried more weight than any explanation could. It was her declaration of freedom, her refusal to be pulled back into their orbit of judgment and control. Beside her, Daniel emerged from the kitchen, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He set one before her and eased into the seat at her side. "You look lighter," he said softly, watching her with eyes that had already seen her pain and still chosen her. Evelyn met his gaze, the corners of her mouth lifting a little higher. "I think I am," she replied. She lifted the glass, the golden liquid catching the faint light of the television, and for the first time all day she felt the sweetness of victory. Not the victory of wealth or public recognition, but the quiet triumph of choosing not to explain, not to justify, not to beg. She had answered in her own way, and it was enough. As she sipped the champagne, Evelyn glanced once more at the phone where messages still poured in unanswered. Her parents could rage, they could panic, they could scramble to piece together a place for themselves in a world they had excluded her from. Sophia could sit in silence, seething with envy, but none of it touched her now. She turned toward Daniel, her hand brushing his as their glasses clinked softly together. For the first time, she felt the kind of freedom she had never dared believe was possible, the freedom of not needing them at all. Evelyn leaned back against the couch, the faint sweetness of champagne lingering on her tongue, her phone still buzzing with unanswered messages. For a long moment she allowed herself to savor the quiet victory of silence, of choosing not to respond in the way her parents demanded. Yet as she sat there, the glow of the television casting shifting shadows on the wall, memories began to creep into the corners of her mind, unbidden and insistent. The panic of her family now, their desperation to be included in the story of her life, brought back with startling clarity all the years when they had chosen to exclude her. And it began as it so often did with birthdays. She was 10 when Sophia turned 8, and the house erupted in celebration. Evelyn remembered the way the dining room had been transformed that day. Balloons clustered in every corner, ribbons streaming from the chandelier, a cake so large it seemed impossible for a single child to consume. Friends and relatives filled the house, their laughter echoing off the walls, their voices raised in cheerful toasts to the youngest Carter daughter. Sophia wore a crown of paper stars and a dress her mother had imported specially for the occasion. Margaret moved through the crowd with a hostess's grace, accepting compliments on her talented, beautiful little girl. Robert stood at the head of the table, his voice booming as he declared how proud he was of his youngest. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her hands clasped behind her back, a small wrapped gift she had made herself hidden from sight. She waited for someone to notice her, to call her into the circle. But the music drowned her silence, and when she stepped forward timidly to offer her present, a drawing she had stayed up late to finish, her mother's hand brushed her away with the words, "Not now, dear. Let's not distract from Sophia's special day." That moment carved itself into her memory like a scar. She had retreated upstairs, clutching her small gift to her chest, listening as the music grew louder and the sound of children's laughter spilled up the staircase. From her bedroom, she could smell the frosting of the cake, hear the clapping as Sophia blew out her candles, imagine the sparkle of the sparklers her parents always saved for the finale. Alone in the dimness of her room, she unwrapped her own drawing, gazing at the bright colors she had chosen so carefully, and whispered a soft happy birthday to herself. Even then, she had learned to let her joy exist privately in shadows, rather than compete for space in a house that had no room for her light. As the years passed, the pattern repeated with cruel consistency. Evelyn's birthdays came and went with little more than passing acknowledgement. Sometimes her father would remember late in the evening, tossing her a perfunctory happy birthday kiddo as though checking off an obligation. Her mother occasionally produced a gift, but more often than not, it was something that had belonged to Sophia. First a book with an inscription already bearing her sister's name, a sweater too small that Margaret insisted looked better on Evelyn anyway. There were no balloons, no guests filling the house with noise, no carefully planned surprises. The dates slipped by as though unworthy of ceremony. She told herself not to mind that she was too old for parties, that such things did not matter. But in the stillness of her room, she could hear the faint echo of Sophia's celebrations and knew the truth. The difference mattered even if no one admitted it. One birthday in particular remained lodged in her memory with unbearable clarity. She had turned 12, a milestone she had secretly hoped might prompt a change. She had imagined perhaps a dinner, or even a cake bought hastily from the corner bakery. Instead, the day came and went without a word. In the evening, when she finally summoned the courage to ask if they had forgotten, her mother handed her a jewelry box. Inside was a necklace, the clasp broken clearly, something Sophia had worn years before. Margaret smiled briskly and said, "At least it's something. Don't be ungrateful." Evelyn thanked her with a voice she forced steady, retreating to her room with the broken necklace clutched in her palm. That night, she sat on her bed in the dark, listening once again as music rose from downstairs where Sophia and her friends practiced piano for yet another performance. Evelyn's own celebration was reduced to silence, her only company the faint light of the moon spilling through her window. Now, as the memory replayed, Evelyn felt the same weight press against her chest. She had been conditioned from a young age to expect little, to accept invisibility as her place in the family. And yet, even then, a part of her had rebelled. Each forgotten birthday, each hand-me-down, disguised as a gift, each dismissal had fueled something deep within her, a quiet conviction that one day she would matter. She had not known how or when, but she had carried that seed with her into adulthood. Tonight, watching her parents' frantic messages pile up on her phone, she realized that seed had finally bloomed. For the first time, they were the ones left outside, watching through the window while the world celebrated her. Evelyn drew in a slow breath, setting the glass of champagne aside. She let the memories settle not as wounds but as proof of how far she had come. The child who once sat alone in the dark, clutching broken gifts and listening to laughter that excluded her, had become a woman the nation now watched with fascination. Her parents' panic was not about her, but about themselves. And Sophia's silence in the chat was no different from the silence Evelyn had endured as a child. Except now the roles were reversed. For once, her sister's voice carried no weight. Evelyn's quiet smile returned as she glanced at the phone and then back at Daniel beside her. The shadows of her childhood had shaped her, but they no longer held her captive. Evelyn let the old memories of forgotten birthdays drift back into silence. But one thought lingered like a splinter. No matter how invisible she had been, there had always been someone standing directly in the spotlight. That someone was Sophia. From the time Sophia could climb onto the piano bench, the Carter household had revolved around her music. Margaret would beam with pride as neighbors gathered in the living room to listen to Sophia stumble her way through Für Elise at age 6, while Robert announced to anyone within earshot that his youngest daughter was destined for greatness. As the years went on, Sophia's skill grew, and with it her parents' devotion. By the time she was 12, she was being flown to competitions in other states. By 16, she was performing in small concert halls across Europe. At every turn, her parents introduced her as our star, their voices swelling with pride. Evelyn, standing beside them, became the quiet afterthought, the shadow that filled the space, so Sophia's brilliance could shine brighter. Evelyn had not resented the piano itself. She loved the way music could stir emotions, how a single piece could carry sorrow or joy. What hurt was the comparison constant and cutting. Every accomplishment Evelyn pursued was filtered through Sophia's success. When Evelyn earned top marks in her architecture classes, Robert barely glanced at her report card before saying, "That's fine, but it's not. Juilliard, is it?" When she spent weeks perfecting a model for a design competition. Margaret looked at it and smiled vaguely, then added, "Sophia just returned from Vienna. You should have seen the ovation she received." Even in casual conversation, the refrain echoed again and again. "Why can't you be more like Sophia?" Each question chipped away at Evelyn's confidence until even her proudest moments felt somehow insufficient. One afternoon remained burned into her memory with humiliating clarity. She had been 17, sitting at the kitchen table with sheets of tracing paper spread before her, working on a design for a community center. She had poured hours into every line, sketching spaces that could bring light and openness into a struggling neighborhood. Sophia wandered in, still glowing from a rehearsal, her fingers tapping out a melody on the countertop. She leaned over Evelyn's shoulder and squinted at the drawing. Then she laughed, a sound sharp as glass. "You just draw houses," she said with mockery, flipping one page as though it were nothing. "Anybody can do that. It's not like you're creating art." Margaret, standing at the sink, had chuckled in agreement, and Robert murmured something about real talent before leaving the room. Evelyn had felt her face burn the sketch beneath her hand, suddenly looking childish, though she knew the ideas in it were strong. She had folded the papers away, pretending not to care, but the sting had stayed with her long after Sophia's footsteps faded down the hall. Over time, Evelyn began to see the cost of Sophia's brilliance. Her sister was radiant in public, dazzling audiences, and basking in their applause, but behind closed doors, she lived under a pressure Evelyn did not envy. Margaret corrected her posture at the piano with merciless precision. Robert demanded perfection in every performance, and Sophia herself drove her body to exhaustion to maintain her reputation as flawless. Evelyn would sometimes pass by her sister's room late at night and hear the muffled sound of sobbing quickly stifled whenever footsteps approached. It struck her even then that Sophia's gilded cage was as confining as her own shadows. She was the star, yes, but a star that burned under relentless scrutiny, never allowed to falter. If Evelyn had been overlooked, Sophia had been consumed. That tension grew sharper as they entered adulthood. Evelyn pursued architecture with steady determination, savoring the way her designs could shape space and offer comfort, while Sophia carried the family's ambitions like a crown too heavy to bear. Their parents never saw Evelyn's freedom for what it was. They dismissed it as aimlessness, as lack of drive. But Sophia did. In her rare, unguarded moments, Sophia's eyes would flicker with something that looked like envy. Evelyn remembered one summer evening when she came home late from working on a studio project. Her clothes were dusty, her hair pulled into a messy bun, but she was glowing with satisfaction. Sophia looked up from the piano, her expression unreadable, and muttered, "Must be nice doing what you want without the whole world watching if you fail." The words had struck Evelyn not as mockery this time, but as confession. For once, her sister's voice had carried the weight of truth. Evelyn knew then that their rivalry was not simple. It was not merely that Sophia had been celebrated while she was ignored. It was that Sophia had been chained to perfection, forced to embody her parents' dream, until she no longer knew where her own desires began. She might have mocked Evelyn's designs, might have relished the favoritism she received, but underneath it all she carried a bitterness of her own, the bitterness of never being free to stumble to choose to live without performance. Evelyn understood that now, sitting years later beside Daniel, her phone still lighting up with her parents' frantic messages. Sophia's silence in the chat was familiar, but she imagined she could almost hear the grinding of her sister's thoughts. The envy stirred not by Evelyn's marriage alone, but by the freedom it represented. For once, Evelyn was not the shadow, and Sophia was not the untouchable star. The roles were shifting, and though Evelyn did not yet know how far she could feel the change like the first tremor before a storm. The memories of Sophia's rise and the constant comparisons still lingered in Evelyn's mind when another set of recollections surfaced, ones she had tried for years to bury. If Sophia had been crowned the star, then Evelyn's milestones had been quietly erased, brushed aside as though they barely mattered. The truth of it came back to her most clearly in the moments when she should have been celebrated the markers of achievement that define a young life. Instead of joy, they had been laced with absence, silence, or thinly veiled disapproval. She remembered the day of her college graduation with particular clarity. The ceremony had been held in a wide auditorium, sunlight filtering through tall windows onto rows of proud parents holding bouquets and cameras. Students bustled in their gowns, some nervous, some giddy, their families clapping and waving as their names were called. Evelyn had walked across the stage with her head high, a degree in architecture pressed into her hands, a lifetime of late nights and relentless work culminating in that single moment. The applause of strangers had filled the hall, but when she looked out across the crowd, searching instinctively for familiar faces, there were none. Her father had called the week before to say they couldn't attend. Sophia had a piano competition in Chicago, and the timing was impossible to change. Margaret's voice had softened slightly when she added, "You'll understand, won't you, dear? This is important for your sister." Evelyn had said yes because she always did, but the emptiness in the auditorium seat reserved under her name stung more sharply than she expected. When she returned to her apartment that evening, the flowers she had bought for herself sat on the kitchen counter, their bright colors mocking the silence of her phone. Worse still was the envelope she kept tucked away in a drawer even years later. It had been meant to hold messages from friends and family, a keepsake of her graduation day. Inside were a few notes from classmates, kind words of encouragement and congratulations. But the space reserved for her parents' signatures remained blank, an emptiness on the page that seemed to scream louder than ink ever could. She had run her finger over that blank spot more times than she cared to admit, wondering what it would have meant to see their handwriting there, to know they had taken even a moment to acknowledge her success. The silence in that envelope mirrored the silence in her life, a constant reminder that her efforts were invisible in her own home. Years later, when Daniel proposed to her, she had hoped naively. She now realized that her parents might see the significance of the moment. He had knelt beneath a canopy of string lights in the park where they had shared their first kiss. His voice unsteady as he asked her to be his wife. She had said yes through tears, laughter bubbling out of her chest, believing for a brief, foolish instant that this was the moment her family might rally around her. But when she called to share the news, the response was tepid at best. Robert's voice was curt, almost suspicious as he asked, "Are you sure this is wise?" Margaret said little more than, "I hope this doesn't embarrass us." And Sophia had stayed silent altogether. Her only contribution, a distracted congratulations text, days later, that carried no warmth. There was no dinner, no champagne, no gathering to honor the next step in her life. Instead, Evelyn had celebrated with Daniel alone, clinking glasses in the quiet of their apartment, while the phone remained silent. She had told herself then that perhaps it was just their way, that her parents were not sentimental people. But deep down she knew better. They had found the time, the energy, the enthusiasm for Sophia's every recital, every competition, every award ceremony. They had driven cross-country boarded planes and hosted lavish gatherings for her. Their absence from Evelyn's milestones was not about lack of sentiment, it was about choice. They chose to invest their pride elsewhere, to pour their energy into Sophia's narrative, while leaving Evelyn to script her own in solitude. Sitting in the present, Evelyn felt the old ache stir in her chest, but with it came a new clarity. Those forgotten moments had shaped her, taught her to rely on herself when others refused to see her. The blank envelope, the silent phone calls, the dismissive comments, all of it had forged a resilience she had never fully acknowledged. She thought of the degree that hung in her office, of the buildings she had designed that stood tall and unyielding. They were monuments not only to her talent, but to her endurance. Her parents had never cheered her across a stage, never lifted a glass in her honor, never written their names on a card meant to commemorate her triumphs. But now they were the ones clamoring for her attention, sending desperate messages into a void she no longer felt compelled to answer. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the memory of that blank graduation card fading into something less like a wound and more like a shield. She had survived their silence once. This time she would not let their voices define her worth. The image of her graduation card with its blank space where her parents' signatures should have been lingered in Evelyn's mind like a brand, and it inevitably drew her thoughts toward her father. Robert had been the louder voice in the family, the one who made declarations that carried the weight of judgment. If Margaret orchestrated appearances with careful hands, Robert laid down the law with blunt words that left no room for interpretation. Evelyn had heard him once, long before her wedding day, say, with absolute certainty, "A cheap wedding makes a family look small. If you can't host a proper celebration, you shouldn't do it at all. It brings shame." He had said it in the middle of a dinner conversation, glass of scotch in hand, with an authority that silenced the table. It had not been about Evelyn then, at least not directly, but she knew he had meant it for her. His disdain for anything that failed to impress others was never hidden. To understand Robert's obsession with appearances, Evelyn had to trace it back to the stories he told of his youth. He had grown up in a small working-class town, the son of a mechanic who could barely keep the family afloat. He spoke rarely of those years, and when he did, it was with a bitterness that curdled in his voice. He described being mocked by classmates for his worn shoes, ridiculed when he could not afford the school trips. Others attended, dismissed by teachers who assumed he would amount to nothing. One particular story had repeated itself so often, Evelyn could recite it at a high school dance. Robert had worn an ill-fitting suit borrowed from his uncle, and a wealthy classmate had laughed aloud, telling him he looked like a beggar dressed for church. From that night forward, Robert carried the shame like a stone in his chest. He had sworn never to be humiliated again, never to allow anyone to look down on him or his family. That vow became the axis around which his life turned. It explained much about how he raised his daughters. He wanted perfection, not because he loved them in the way that nurtured, but because he wanted to be reflected in their success. Sophia fit the role seamlessly. She was the polished star, the child who could be displayed proudly at parties, her talent undeniable, her accolades easy to boast about. Robert introduced her at gatherings as our Sophia the prodigy, bound for greatness. He puffed his chest as he told neighbors about her concerts abroad, about the invitations from prestigious venues. Evelyn, by contrast, never gave him that satisfaction. Architecture in his eyes was not glamorous enough to elevate the family name. He dismissed her achievements as though they were curiosities, not accomplishments. Evelyn recalled the night she had won a national award for a sustainable housing design. She had worked for months pouring her creativity into a project that balanced aesthetics with environmental responsibility. The award came with recognition in an architectural journal and a plaque she had carried home with pride. She had placed it carefully on the mantel, hoping her parents would see it and perhaps for once acknowledge her achievement. Robert had walked into the room that evening, his eyes scanning the plaque briefly before he poured himself a drink. "That's nice," he said flatly. "But it's not the kind of thing people talk about. It's not worth bragging over." He had then shifted the conversation to Sophia's latest recital, as if Evelyn's award was no more significant than a trinket. Later that night, Evelyn moved the plaque to her bedroom, where it sat on her dresser, hidden from view, but close enough that she could remind herself it was real. Her father's words had cut, but they could not erase the truth of her talent. Robert's fixation on reputation extended beyond dismissing Evelyn's work. He measured every event, every moment, by how it would look to others. When Evelyn had spoken about wanting a small, intimate wedding, he scoffed, saying, "A cheap wedding tells the world you are nobody. It drags the family name through the mud." He never once asked what she wanted, never considered that a wedding could be about love rather than spectacle. For him, everything was performance, and failure to impress meant disgrace. The irony, Evelyn realized, was that his obsession with avoiding shame had driven him to treat his own daughter as though she were already a source of it. In his effort to build a flawless image, he had created cracks so deep they could never be concealed. Even now, years later, she could still hear the sharpness in his voice, the way he made his standards sound like commandments from on high. His words had taught her to shrink, to question whether her dreams were valid, to doubt if she could ever measure up. Yet beneath his coldness, Evelyn could glimpse the boy he had once been humiliated at a dance, desperate to prove he was more than the laughter that followed him home. She did not excuse him. His scars had become her own wounds, but she understood the roots of his cruelty. Understanding, however, was not forgiveness. His need for perfection had cost her the tenderness of a father's pride, a loss no recognition could replace. As she sat remembering, Evelyn knew with painful clarity that Robert's obsession with a perfect family had never included her. The memory of Robert's voice, sharp and uncompromising, still echoed in Evelyn's mind long after the wedding day had ended. His obsession with perfection, his fixation on appearances, had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. For years, she had carried the weight of his words, bending under the pressure of his disapproval, aching for a moment of recognition that never came. But as she sat in her apartment days after the ceremony, the glow of the television finally dimmed, she realized that something within her had shifted. The tide of her life was changing, and for the first time she was no longer standing in its current. She was steering it. She rose from the couch and walked into her bedroom, the quiet of the night pressing in around her. The mirror above her dresser caught her reflection, and she paused to study it. For a moment she hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. The white gown had been carefully folded away, the veil tucked into its box, but a trace of the bride still lingered in her eyes. Not the vulnerable woman waiting for her parents to appear, but someone steadier, clearer. Her gaze lingered on the curve of her mouth, the straightness of her shoulders, the determination that had been forged in silence and absence. Slowly, deliberately, she whispered aloud to the glass, "I will live for myself." The words were soft, but they carried a weight she had never spoken before. It was a vow not to Daniel, not to her parents, but to herself. Her phone lay on the dresser, its dark screen reflecting the faint light of the lamp. She picked it up and opened her contacts, scrolling through the list of names that had once tied her to the people she thought she needed most. Robert, Margaret, Sophia. Each name stared back at her, reminders of years spent hoping, waiting, and being disappointed. Her thumb hovered over the delete button, hesitation pricking at her chest. To remove them felt final, like closing a door she had spent her life knocking on without answer. But as the seconds passed, she realized the truth: the door had never been open. She pressed her thumb firmly, and one by one the names disappeared. When the list was empty, she set the phone down again, lighter somehow, as though she had laid down a burden she had carried too long. The silence that followed was not empty, but freeing. For years she had filled quiet moments with the ache of wanting her family's approval. She had imagined their faces in the crowd at her graduation, heard phantom applause that never came, pictured their smiles at her engagement. Now, with their numbers gone from her phone, she felt the emptiness transform into space she could finally claim as her own. She thought back to something Daniel had once said, his words echoing with new clarity. It had been a quiet evening months before the wedding when she had confessed her fear that her family would never see her for who she was. Daniel had taken her hand, his eyes steady on hers, and said, "You don't need them to prove who you are. You've already done that. You don't need anyone's permission to exist." At the time she had nodded but tucked the thought away, too tangled in old wounds to believe it fully. Now, in the dim light of her bedroom, she understood. He had seen her worth long before she had. She walked back to the mirror and studied herself again this time, without searching for flaws or shadows. She was not the forgotten daughter standing in Sophia's light. She was a woman who had built something from nothing, who had endured neglect and turned it into strength. Her wedding had not been a disgrace, no matter what her father had said. It had been a beginning, a chance to step into a life not measured by their standards, but by her own. The cameras that had flashed the broadcast that had stunned the nation, those were not gifts of wealth or spectacle. They were proof that her story was no longer confined to the quiet corners where she had once sat unseen. The thought settled over her like a warm blanket. For years, she had waited for her parents to applaud, to recognize, to love her in the way she deserved. Tonight, she realized she did not need to wait any longer. Their silence had shaped her, but it would not define her. She had Daniel, she had her work, she had herself, and that was enough. The old Evelyn might have opened her phone again, waiting for another message, another chance at reconciliation. But the new Evelyn placed the phone face down and turned away. She no longer needed the validation of people who had refused to give it. Standing there with the quiet hum of the city outside her window, Evelyn felt something she had never truly felt before: peace. It was not the absence of pain, her scars were still there, the memories still sharp, but it was the acceptance that she did not have to live for anyone else's gaze. She had her own. She lifted her chin slightly, catching her reflection one last time. "I will not wait for them," she whispered again, firmer now. "I am enough." With that, she turned off the light and stepped into the next chapter of her life, no longer bound by the approval she had once chased, but free to write her story on her own terms. The days that followed Evelyn's quiet vow to herself were strangely calm. She carried on with her work, poured her energy into sketches and plans, and allowed herself to relish the peace that came from not checking her phone for her parents' words. Yet the silence did not last long. Late one afternoon, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and though she almost ignored it, something compelled her to answer. Margaret's voice emerged clipped and carefully measured. "Evelyn?" "She said your father and I think it's time you came home. We need to talk." The word need was weighted, carrying the same authority her parents had wielded over her for decades. Before Evelyn could respond, Robert's voice came onto the line, firm and commanding. "Tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock. Don't be late." Then the line went dead. For a moment, Evelyn simply stood in her apartment, the dial tone echoing in her ear. The old reflex to obey stirred inside her, but she shook it off. She was no longer the daughter waiting for their approval. Still, she felt the pull of inevitability. They had summoned her, and she would go not as a child desperate for recognition, but as a woman prepared to stand her ground. She closed her phone slowly, a steady calm settling over her. This time the conversation would be different. When she arrived the next evening, the Carter house looked exactly as it always had. The manicured lawn, the spotless porch, the gleam of Margaret's carefully polished windows, all whispered of a family desperate to project perfection. Evelyn walked up the steps with deliberate calm, her heels clicking against the wood, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. Margaret opened the door before she had even knocked her expression a mask of strained warmth. "Evelyn," she said with a thin smile. "Come in." Robert waited just behind her, his posture stiff, his eyes sharp with unspoken judgment. They led her into the living room, the same space where she had spent countless evenings as a child, watching Sophia play piano while her parents applauded. Tonight, however, the room felt charged, as though the very air bristled with confrontation. Margaret gestured toward the sofa. "Sit," she said, her tone hovering between command and courtesy. Evelyn sat with measured grace, crossing her legs, refusing to shrink into the cushions. Robert stood before her, arms folded, his gaze piercing. Margaret perched on the edge of an armchair, hands clasped tightly together. Robert spoke first. "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice was steady but edged with accusation. "Why didn't you tell us Daniel is a billionaire? Do you have any idea how it looked finding out on television like everyone else?" Margaret added quickly, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You made us look like fools. People are calling asking why we didn't say anything. How could you keep something like this from your own family?" Evelyn let their words hang in the air for a moment, studying them. For years she had longed for these questions, hoped they would one day care enough to ask about her life. Yet now, hearing them spoken aloud, she felt no gratitude, only clarity. She drew in a slow breath and replied, her voice even and strong. "I didn't hide anything. You never asked, not once." The silence that followed was heavy. Robert blinked, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in her lap. Evelyn continued, her eyes steady on her father's. "You never wanted to know. You dismissed him without meeting him. You dismissed me. So don't accuse me of hiding when it was your choice not to see." The tension thickened. Robert's jaw clenched, his pride unwilling to admit the truth she had laid bare. Margaret tried to recover her tone, softening though her eyes remained hard. "We only wanted what was best for you, Evelyn. We didn't think he was appropriate. You must understand we couldn't have known." Evelyn's laugh was short and bitter. "Couldn't have known, or didn't care to. All you ever saw was whether something made you look good. If it didn't, you turned away." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower, more pointed. "Now the world knows Daniel, and suddenly you're interested. That says everything." For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked. Her lips trembled, and she glanced at Robert, who stood rooted, his silence louder than any defense he might have offered. Evelyn felt the old ache rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She was not here to beg, not here to explain herself into worthiness. She was here to state the truth plainly and without apology. She sat back against the sofa, her shoulders squared, her eyes unflinching. "I didn't hide Daniel," she repeated firmly. "I never needed to. The only thing hidden was me, and you made sure of that." The words lingered in the stillness, undeniable and unyielding. For once, Robert had no retort, Margaret no ready excuse. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt the balance of power shift. She was no longer the child waiting for their approval, but the woman who had found her strength without it. The silence that followed Evelyn's declaration in the living room carried over into dinner. Margaret, in her usual way, attempted to smooth the edges by insisting everyone move to the dining table. The table was set with polished silverware and heavy china, a setting that should have reflected elegance, but instead only heightened the tension. The dishes gleamed beneath the chandelier, and the pot roast Margaret had prepared sat steaming in the center. Evelyn took her seat with a deliberate calm, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Across from her, Robert occupied the head of the table, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on her with a sternness that reminded her of every childhood scolding. Margaret hovered at his side, pouring wine into crystal glasses, her hands betraying a faint tremor. Sophia sat to one side, unusually quiet, her gaze darting between Evelyn and their parents. For several minutes, the only sounds were the clink of silverware against china, the scrape of chairs shifting as people settled, and the muted tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Evelyn took a measured bite, determined not to break the silence first. She would not hand them that power. But it was Robert, as she expected, who finally spoke. His voice was hard, cutting into the quiet like a blade. "Tell me, Evelyn," he said, "was it the money? Is that why you married him? Because no one in their right mind could believe you married out of anything else." His eyes narrowed as though daring her to deny it. The words, though spoken with certainty, were tinged with something else, fear perhaps, or disbelief, that his long-dismissed daughter had found a life he could not control. Evelyn set down her fork, the silver making a faint sound as it touched porcelain. She met her father's gaze steadily, refusing to look away. "You think I married Daniel for his money?" she asked, her voice calm but resonant. "Then you know even less about me than I thought." Robert scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "What else could it be? You've never been the shining one. You've never been the one to bring pride to this family. And suddenly you're on national television, the wife of a billionaire. How else do you explain it?" Margaret winced slightly at his words, but she said nothing, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Evelyn inhaled slowly, letting the air steady her, then leaned forward just enough to command the table's attention. "You want an explanation? Fine. I'm not ashamed to give it. I am an architect. Not just any architect, but one who won a national award for a sustainable housing project. I have designed hotels, community centers, and homes that have changed people's lives. My work has been published, recognized, honored. And every time I sent you invitations, I wrote letters, I left messages, I asked you to come see what I had done just once. But you never came." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded program she had carried with her, the edges worn with age. She opened it and placed it gently on the table. The cover bore her name in bold print, announcing her as the recipient of a design award. "I sent this to you," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "I invited you to the ceremony. I waited in that hall hoping to see your faces. And you never walked through the door." The room grew still, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Robert's face tightened, his jaw working as though he struggled to find an argument. Margaret, after a long silence, cleared her throat, her voice tentative. "We were busy, Evelyn. You know how much pressure Sophia was under at the time. She had that international competition. We couldn't split ourselves in two." Her tone tried for sympathy, but it rang hollow. Evelyn's lips curved in a bitter smile, and she shook her head slowly. Busy, she repeated, her voice cool but unwavering. "Busy for Sophia. Always for Sophia. Never for me. My milestones, my achievements, my life always less important than making sure your golden daughter shined." Margaret opened her mouth as though to protest, but no words came. Sophia shifted uncomfortably, her hands knotting together in her lap, guilt flickering across her face. Robert's expression hardened further, as though clinging to his pride was the only shield left to him. But Evelyn no longer needed their recognition. She had laid the truth before them, undeniable and raw. For years, she had swallowed the hurt, pretending it did not matter. Tonight, she let it spill across the table like spilled wine, staining the perfection they had tried so hard to maintain. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving her father's. "I didn't marry Daniel for his money," she said, her voice steady, final. "I married him because he sees me. Something you never chose to do." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. And for the first time, Evelyn felt the weight shift entirely onto their shoulders. The silence after Evelyn's last words hung heavy in the dining room. Robert's jaw was tight. Margaret's hands were clenched together as if in prayer, and Sophia shifted uneasily in her seat. The air was brittle, charged with unspoken accusations and years of unhealed wounds. Evelyn sat upright, unflinching, but she could feel the pressure of their eyes pressing against her. Then, just as Robert opened his mouth, the sound of the front door opening echoed down the hallway. Footsteps approached, steady and assured, and when Daniel stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He carried himself with a calm authority that made even Robert lean back slightly in his chair. Dressed sharply but without ostentation, he filled the space not with noise, but with presence. Evelyn felt the tension in her shoulders ease as he came to stand behind her, one hand resting lightly on her chair, a silent gesture of support that spoke volumes. Robert cleared his throat, his voice colder than before. "So the man of the hour finally arrives." Margaret's lips curved into a tight smile, though her eyes were sharp with calculation. "We were just discussing what might have drawn you to our daughter." The implication in her tone was unmistakable. Daniel's gaze moved slowly across the table, pausing on each of them before he spoke.
"I know what you've been saying."
He began, his voice calm but cutting through the room like steel wrapped in velvet. "And I won't let you reduce Evelyn to some caricature who married for money. She deserves better than that. Far better." Robert's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. Daniel continued, his tone steady, deliberate. "What you don't know, and what Evelyn was too proud to share, is that she refused me 3 times before she said yes. 3 times I asked her to marry me. 3 times she told me no. Not because she didn't love me, but because she wanted to make sure she wasn't defined by what I had. She wanted to be certain that when she said yes, it was her decision, not because of wealth or pressure, but because she wanted a life with me. That is who your daughter is." He let the words sink in his hand, still resting gently on Evelyn's chair. Her chest tightened with emotion at his defense, the truth of it laid bare before those who had always dismissed her. Margaret's composure faltered, her lips parting in surprise. Sophia glanced at Evelyn with wide eyes, as though seeing her sister through a new lens. Robert remained silent, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. Daniel's gaze softened slightly as he turned to Evelyn, and for a moment the world outside their bond seemed to fall away. "I still remember the first time I saw her." He said, his voice gentler now, almost reverent. She was presenting a design for a community center at a conference. The room was full of people, most of them older, dismissive, not expecting much from a young architect. But when she spoke, when she laid out her vision, the entire room fell silent. Her ideas weren't just practical, they were beautiful. She saw what no one else saw. I remember thinking then that I was watching someone extraordinary, and I wasn't wrong. The weight of his words filled the space, and Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She had never heard him describe that moment in front of others before. She remembered it too, the way her hands had trembled slightly as she clicked through the slides, the uncertainty that had lingered in her chest until she realized people were listening. Truly listening. And now to hear Daniel recount it with such admiration in front of the very family who had never once acknowledged her accomplishments was like a salve on an old wound. Daniel straightened, his voice firm once more. "I don't love Evelyn because of what she does for me or what she represents. I love her because she is Evelyn, because she is strong and brilliant and compassionate even after years of being overlooked. Because she makes me better just by being herself. That's the truth. And it has nothing to do with money and everything to do with who she is." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy weight of judgment, but the stunned quiet of people who had been confronted with something undeniable. Robert shifted in his chair, his eyes flickering toward Evelyn for the briefest of moments before darting away. Margaret pressed her lips together, unable to form a reply. Sophia's gaze lingered on her sister, unreadable but softer than it had been in years. Evelyn sat with her head held high, the sting of her parents' accusations still present, but dulled by Daniel's words. She no longer felt alone at that table. His defense had not only affirmed her worth, but forced her family to see her through different eyes, if only for a moment. She glanced up at him, gratitude and love shining in her expression, and knew that whatever came next, she was no longer standing in this battle by herself. Daniel's final words lingered in the air like a verdict. "I love her because she is Evelyn." And in that moment, no one at the table could deny it. The weight of Daniel's words still lingered in the air, his declaration of love silencing the accusations that had filled the dining room only moments before. Evelyn sat straighter, a faint warmth spreading in her chest, despite the chill of her parents' stares. For once someone had spoken her truth aloud. Yet before the moment could settle, Daniel's gaze shifted across the table, landing on Sophia. His expression hardened, and Evelyn felt a sudden tension ripple through him. He drew in a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was measured, but there was steel beneath it. "There's something else that needs to be said." something I've kept to myself until now." The room seemed to contract, the clink of silverware silenced, the faint tick of the clock suddenly magnified. Evelyn's eyes darted to Daniel, searching his face, sensing the gravity of what he was about to reveal. He turned fully toward Sophia, his jaw set. "Before the wedding, your sister came to see me. She told me not to marry Evelyn. She said Evelyn was only after my money." For a moment, no one moved. Evelyn felt the words hit her like a physical blow, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes swung to Sophia, who sat frozen, her face paling. "That's not true," Sophia said quickly, her voice sharp with panic. "He's lying. I never—" But the tremor in her voice betrayed her, and her eyes flickered downward, avoiding her sister's gaze. Evelyn's heart clenched as recognition dawned. She knew that look. It was the same look Sophia had worn as a child when caught in a lie, the same mixture of guilt and defiance that had never needed words to be understood. Daniel's tone was unwavering. "I remember every word, Sophia. You told me Evelyn wasn't serious, that she would leave me once she had enough. You tried to poison what we had before it even began. And I let it go for Evelyn's sake because I knew she loved you despite everything. But tonight I won't let that lie stand any longer." His eyes did not waver from Sophia, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. Margaret gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, while Robert's face darkened with confusion and anger, though he remained silent. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears, each beat sharper than the last. She turned toward her sister, her voice quiet but carrying across the room. "Is it true?" she asked. Sophia shook her head quickly, her words stumbling over each other. "No, I swear I didn't. He misunderstood. I was only worried about you, Evelyn. I thought he might hurt you, and I said things I didn't mean." Her excuses unraveled as she spoke, the desperation in her tone only confirming the truth. Evelyn studied her carefully, her chest aching, her stomach twisting. She wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the hope that her sister, despite everything, had never crossed that line. But the guilt in Sophia's eyes told another story. Memories rose, unbidden moments from their childhood, when Sophia had basked in the spotlight, her parents' constant applause drowning out Evelyn's quiet accomplishments. Evelyn had excused it, told herself it wasn't Sophia's fault. But now, as she stared into the face of her sister, she saw the jealousy that had always lingered beneath the surface. Sophia, the golden child, who had everything yet still coveted what Evelyn had built for herself. The betrayal cut deep, not only because of the words spoken, but because it confirmed what Evelyn had long feared: her sister had never wanted her to shine. The ache in her chest sharpened into something else. She sat back slowly, her fork untouched on the plate before her. "You told him I only cared about money?" Evelyn said, her voice low but steady. "After everything I've endured, after a lifetime of being overlooked, you tried to take even this from me." Sophia flinched, her lips parting as though to protest again, but no words came. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's hand brushed Evelyn's shoulder, lightly grounding her, reminding her that she was not alone in this moment. The betrayal stung, but beneath the pain was a clarity Evelyn could not ignore. For years she had envied her sister's place in their parents' eyes, convinced that Sophia had it all. But now she saw the truth. Sophia, for all her praise and applause, was trapped in the need to be perfect to hold her parents' favor, to prevent Evelyn from ever threatening her place as the family's golden child. It was envy that had driven her to Daniel, envy that had led her to twist his view of Evelyn. And for the first time, Evelyn pitied her. Her sister's shine had always come at someone else's expense, and now it was dimming before her eyes. She spoke again, softer this time, but no less firm. "I may have been invisible to them, Sophia, but to go to him and try to make me invisible in my own marriage? That was your choice, and it's something I won't forget." The words struck their target, and Sophia's face crumpled, her eyes filling with tears. She quickly blinked away. Margaret shifted, uncomfortably torn between her daughters, while Robert remained rigid, his pride silenced for once. Evelyn held her sister's gaze a moment longer, then turned away, her decision made. The wound was fresh, raw, but it no longer controlled her. She could see it clearly now. Sophia's betrayal was not proof of Evelyn's weakness, but of her sister's fear. And in that knowledge, Evelyn found a strength she had never claimed before. The silence after Daniel's revelation about Sophia's betrayal clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Sophia's teary eyes darted to their mother for rescue, but Margaret sat rigid, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. For a long moment, the clatter of utensils and the faint hum of the grandfather clock were the only sounds. Then, as if a dam had broken, Margaret's composure cracked. Her voice wavered as she whispered, "Evelyn, we thought you were strong. Stronger than Sophia. Stronger than we ever were. We believed you didn't need us." Her words grew louder, spilling into the room. "You were always so independent, so self-sufficient. We told ourselves that's why we didn't show up. We thought you didn't need the same attention. We thought you could carry yourself without us." Her eyes glistened with tears that rolled down her cheeks, her hands clutching the edge of the table as though the wood could anchor her in the storm she had unleashed. Robert shifted uncomfortably, but he remained silent, his pride barricading any admission of guilt. Margaret pressed on, her voice breaking. "We loved you, Evelyn, we did. But you always seemed apart. You never begged for our praise like Sophia did, never fought for our approval. We thought you didn't want it." She looked at her daughter with watery eyes, searching for understanding, for absolution. Evelyn's breath caught in her chest, but not from sympathy. The words pierced her, but not in the way her mother intended. She sat straighter, her voice calm but lined with steel. "No one," she said slowly, each syllable measured, "is so strong that they can live invisible for 30 years. Not one person. Not me. Not anyone." Her gaze swept from her mother to her father, then to her sister, holding each of them accountable in turn. "You didn't withhold love because I didn't need it. You withheld it because you chose not to give it. Because Sophia made it easier for you. Because her spotlight blinded you to the shadows you left me in." Margaret's lips trembled. "That's not fair," she began, but Evelyn cut across her, her voice rising not in a scream but in a surge of long-suppressed truth. "Fair. Do you think it was fair to watch me win awards and never show up? Do you think it was fair to dismiss every accomplishment I had as if it meant nothing? Do you think it was fair to let me sit alone on birthdays while you lit candles for Sophia's? Don't stand there and tell me you thought I was strong. You didn't see me at all. You didn't want to." The words rang through the dining room, bouncing off the walls that had once echoed with Sophia's piano recitals and the hollow applause of parents who saved all their pride for only one daughter. Evelyn's chest heaved, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring herself now, but this time not in desperation, this time in defiance. Margaret's tears fell silently, her face crumpling under the weight of Evelyn's truth, but she offered no rebuttal. Robert stared at his plate, his silence louder than any defense he might have mustered. Sophia looked away, shame etched across her features. Evelyn exhaled, the fury within her softening into clarity. She released her grip on the table, her hands falling gracefully to her lap. "I spent my life thinking, if I just tried harder, if I just achieved more, you would finally see me. But tonight I understand. It was never about me. It was about you. About your image, your pride, your need for perfection. And I will not spend another day begging for scraps of affection you were never willing to give." With that, Evelyn pushed back her chair. The wooden legs scraped against the polished floor, a sharp sound that broke the heavy silence. She rose slowly, deliberately, her posture tall, her chin lifted. For a moment she stood at the head of the table, her figure illuminated by the chandelier commanding the space in a way she never had before. Her family stared up at her, startled, as though seeing her for the first time. Margaret's tears glistened, Robert's jaw tightened. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Evelyn's voice, quiet but firm, cut through their stunned expressions. "I won't be invisible anymore." She turned and walked from the dining room. Each step measured her heels, striking the floor with a certainty that echoed long after she disappeared down the hall. Behind her, the family sat in silence, frozen in their seats, left to grapple with the truth she had laid bare. The clink of silverware had ceased, the conversation extinguished. Only the hollow tick of the clock filled the void, counting the seconds of their stunned disbelief. Evelyn did not look back. For once, she did not need to. Robert sat in the dining room long after Evelyn's footsteps had faded down the hall, the echo of her words still hanging in the air like smoke. For a man who had always prided himself on having the last word, his silence was uncharacteristic, almost unsettling. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders shaking while Sophia stared fixedly at her untouched plate, her face pale. But Robert did not speak. He sat rigid, his broad hands resting on the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched. For the first time in decades, he had nothing to say. His gaze drifted toward the sideboard where a framed family photograph had rested for years. It was from when the girls were young, a carefully posed picture taken during one of Sophia's recitals. Sophia sat at the piano in her white dress, Margaret's arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling brightly. Robert stood behind them, his hand on Sophia's chair, pride practically radiating from his face. And then there was Evelyn off to the side, her smile tentative, her posture uncertain as if she had been placed there at the last moment. He had looked at that photo countless times before and always thought it perfect. Tonight the perfection crumbled. He saw now what Evelyn had described: the imbalance, the neglect, the way she had been edged out of their lives. For the first time, the photograph didn't look like pride. It looked like failure. Robert reached for the frame, his fingers brushing against the glass. The faint layer of dust that had gathered on the corner where Evelyn stood was undeniable, a symbol of what had been overlooked for too long. He stared at her younger face, at the smile that had never quite reached her eyes, and something inside him shifted. He remembered the nights she had worked late at the kitchen table, sketching designs by the dim light papers spread across the wood. He had dismissed it, then told her it was a hobby, not a future. He remembered the day she brought home her first award from college, her eyes glowing with excitement, and he had brushed it aside, more concerned about Sophia's next performance. The memories piled up heavy and damning until his silence became not just the absence of words, but the weight of regret. Daniel, who had remained quiet after Evelyn's exit, leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Carter," he said, addressing Robert directly. "There's an event this weekend. A gala. Evelyn is being honored for her contributions to architecture. Her latest project brought millions in revenue to the city, revitalized an entire district. It's the kind of recognition most architects dream of, and she deserves to be celebrated." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "I want you to come. Both of you. Even Sophia. See her as she is, not as the daughter you've ignored, but as the woman she's become. It's not about appearances. It's about giving her what she's always deserved to be seen." The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Margaret looked at Robert, her eyes searching his face for a cue for the usual wall of resistance he put up whenever Evelyn's name came with anything resembling success. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her guilt still fresh, but even she glanced toward her father, waiting for his response. Robert's eyes remained fixed on the photograph in his hands. His thumb traced the outline of Evelyn's small figure, his mind turning over memories he had long buried, excuses he had long rehearsed. He could feel the walls he had built around himself starting to crack. At length he set the photograph down carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid of shattering what was left. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "A gala," he said, as if testing the word. His eyes flicked up to Daniel, then to Margaret, then briefly to Sophia. Finally, he gave the smallest of nods. "We'll be there." The admission was simple, but it carried a weight far greater than the words themselves. For Robert, it was not just agreement to attend an event. It was the first time in Evelyn's life that he had not dismissed her success, the first time he had not found a reason to turn away. Margaret let out a soft breath, relief mingling with her lingering tears. Sophia lowered her gaze, shame pooling in her features, though she said nothing. Daniel nodded once, his expression calm but satisfied. He had seen the shift subtle but significant in the man across the table. And Robert, for all his pride and stubbornness, sat back in his chair, his silence no longer the silence of indifference but the silence of a man wrestling with the weight of his own choices. For the first time he had not fought, had not argued, had not turned his back. And in that silence Evelyn's absence was louder than her presence had ever been. The night of the gala descended upon the city with a kind of electric brilliance that made the skyline shimmer. Outside the grand ballroom, a row of black cars pulled to the curb, spilling out men in tuxedos and women draped in gowns that glittered under the flash of cameras. Photographers shouted names, flashes strobed across the pavement. Reporters pressed microphones toward whoever happened to be stepping onto the crimson carpet. The entire event pulsed with a grandeur that felt almost unreal, as though the city itself had paused to bear witness. For Evelyn, standing at the threshold with Daniel, it was a moment she had never imagined herself inhabiting. She adjusted the hem of her gown, a sweeping emerald silk that hugged her frame and caught the light like the surface of a jewel, and tried to steady the tremor in her hands. Though the fabric shimmered with confidence, her heart beat a nervous rhythm beneath it. The magnitude of what was to come loomed in her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Daniel stood beside her, unflappable in his tailored tuxedo, his presence radiating calm assurance. He had walked carpets like these countless times before, had stood before cameras and boardrooms, and the scrutiny of the press without ever faltering. He turned to her now, his eyes steady, his hand reaching for hers. The warmth of his touch grounded her, pulling her back from the swell of anxiety rising in her chest. "Evelyn," he said softly, his voice cutting through the chaos with the intimacy of a whisper, meant only for her. "Tonight is yours. Not mine, not anyone else's. Yours." She looked at him, searching his face, and saw no trace of doubt, only conviction. The words sank into her, a promise and a challenge both, and she nodded slowly, forcing her breath to steady. The car door opened, and Daniel stepped out first, offering his hand as the cameras immediately flared to life. When Evelyn placed her fingers in his and followed him onto the carpet, a hush seemed to ripple through the crowd. The photographers shouted his name at first, but then her presence caught them. The gown, the poised carriage of her shoulders, the quiet dignity in her expression, it all seemed to shift the energy. "Who is she?" a voice called from the press line. "That's Evelyn Carter," another answered the architect. "She's the one being honored tonight." Evelyn felt the words wash over her like an unexpected tide. For years she had walked into rooms unnoticed, her accomplishments buried in the shadows of her sister's spotlight. Tonight, she was not invisible. Tonight, the world was watching. As they made their way into the ballroom, Evelyn's nerves clung to her like a second skin. The chandeliers dripped crystal light onto tables draped in ivory linen, each one adorned with arrangements of orchids and roses. Waiters wove through the crowd with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played in the corner, their music soft yet insistent, filling the space with elegance. Politicians, philanthropists, and leaders of industry mingled their conversations, punctuated by laughter and the occasional call of recognition. Every glance seemed to find Evelyn some curious others admiring, and a few sharp with envy. She held her head high, though the knot in her stomach remained. This was her moment, but the ghosts of years past whispered in her ear, telling her she was an imposter in rooms like these. Daniel seemed to sense the weight of her thoughts. He leaned close, his words meant only for her. "Do you know why they're all looking at you?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her lips parting in a question she didn't need to ask. He squeezed her hand. "Because you belong here. Because you earned it." His certainty washed over her like a balm, quieting the whispers that had always haunted her. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe him, even if only for a moment. They were led to their table near the stage, where Evelyn's name was printed on a gleaming card in elegant script. She traced the letters with her finger, marveling at the simple fact of it, her name not attached to anyone else, not hidden behind someone else's triumph, but standing alone in recognition. Across the room, she caught sight of the press cameras setting up the red lights, blinking the crews murmuring as they prepared to broadcast the evening live. Her pulse quickened again, but this time the energy was sharper, less fear, and more anticipation. She knew what was coming. She knew her parents and sister would be watching, perhaps even attending, and the thought of it both unsettled and exhilarated her. The evening unfolded around her in a swirl of conversation and laughter, but Evelyn felt as though she were suspended, waiting for the moment the spotlight would turn. The weight of expectation pressed against her shoulders, the kind of pressure that once would have crushed her. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "Tonight is yours." And with each repetition she felt the old fear loosening its grip. When she glanced at him again, he met her gaze with the same quiet confidence, as though daring her to believe it fully. She straightened in her chair, her chin lifting, her hands steady now against the silk of her gown. The master of ceremonies took the stage at last, his voice carrying easily across the hall. The music softened, the conversations hushed, and the spotlight swung across the room until it landed on Evelyn. She drew in a deep breath, her heart leaping, but she did not falter. As the announcer spoke her name, as the audience began to applaud, she felt the tide shift within her. No longer the forgotten daughter, no longer the invisible sister. She was Evelyn, the architect, the honoree, the woman who had carved her own place in the world. And as she rose to her feet, Daniel's hand steady in hers, his whisper found her once more. "Tonight," he said, his eyes holding hers, "is yours." And this time she believed him without question. The master of ceremonies stood tall at the podium, his polished voice cutting clearly through the hushed grandeur of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, the cadence of his words commanding the attention of every guest tonight, "we honor a woman whose vision and brilliance have not only redefined the skyline of this city, but have also breathed life into an entire district that once stood on the brink of collapse." The room fell into stillness, the words gathering weight before they landed. Evelyn, seated at her table, felt her breath catch as her name followed. Evelyn Carter, the architect behind the Harborview Hotel project. A development that has increased local revenue by tens of millions of dollars, revitalized tourism, and created hundreds of jobs for our community. The applause began almost immediately, a ripple that swelled into a crashing wave. The spotlight swept across the room and came to rest on her, bathing her in brilliance so bright it momentarily blurred her vision. She rose slowly, her gown shimmering under the light, and every eye followed her ascent. The sound of clapping grew louder, punctuated by cheers and the shuffle of guests rising to their feet. Evelyn felt her knees tremble, but she forced her spine straight, her chin high. For years she had waited for recognition, for someone to call her name with pride rather than condescension, and tonight it came not as a whisper, but as a roar. Daniel's hand brushed against hers as she stepped toward the stage, a silent reassurance that steadied her steps. The applause did not falter as she crossed the polished floor heels, striking in time with her racing heartbeat. When she reached the podium, the master of ceremonies extended a hand, his smile warm, his gesture grand. She accepted the award, an engraved crystal sculpture that caught the spotlight and fractured it into 1,000 dancing shards. And for a brief moment, Evelyn saw herself reflected in its surface. Not the forgotten daughter, not the overlooked sister, but the woman who had built something lasting and undeniable. As she turned to face the audience, the room erupted again, the sound rolling over her like thunder. She searched the crowd faces blurred in the glare of the lights, yet she caught sight of Daniel. His eyes locked on hers with quiet pride. It was his voice she heard above the applause, though he had not spoken, "Tonight is yours." Her pulse steadied. For the first time in her life, she believed it entirely. Far away in the familiar living room of the Carter home, the scene unfolded on a flat-screen television. Robert sat stiffly in his recliner, his hands gripping the arms as though bracing against an invisible force. Margaret perched on the edge of the couch, her eyes wide, her lips parted, her face pale in the glow of the screen. Sophia sat nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched, though her gaze never wavered from the broadcast. The cameras panned in on Evelyn as she stood at the podium, her figure regal beneath the spotlight, her voice beginning to fill the hall. The image was clear, undeniable. Their Evelyn. The daughter they had dismissed, belittled, overlooked, standing before a national audience as the woman being celebrated above all others. Robert's throat worked as he tried to swallow, but no words came. He had always told himself that Evelyn's pursuits were trivial, that architecture was not a legacy worth boasting about. Yet here it was, her work credited with saving a city district, her name spoken with reverence by leaders and broadcast across the country. His hand slipped from the armrest and the glass of scotch he had been nursing tumbled to the carpet. Amber liquid spreading like a dark stain across the rug. Margaret flinched at the sound, but her eyes never left the screen. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips as Evelyn's voice carried steady and proud. The years of neglect, the excuses, the blind devotion to Sophia, all of it stared back at her in stark relief. She whispered Evelyn's name, barely audible, as though trying to reconcile the child she had ignored with the woman commanding the nation's attention. Sophia's reaction was quieter, but no less telling. She leaned forward slightly, her arms still crossed, but her eyes glistened in the flickering light of the television. Envy warred with something else, shame, perhaps, or the faint recognition of a truth she could no longer deny. Her sister, the one she had mocked and dismissed, was no longer in her shadow. If anything, Sophia felt the ground shifting beneath her, the spotlight she had clung to for so long now blazing over Evelyn instead. She tightened her grip on her arms' nails, digging into her skin, but she could not look away. She could not deny what was unfolding before her. Back in the ballroom, Evelyn spoke, her voice even and measured, resonating through the hall and into living rooms across the country. She spoke of her passion for design, of the belief that spaces could shape lives, of her gratitude for those who had supported her journey. She did not mention her family. She did not need to. The omission was louder than any accusation, a silence that told its own story. The applause rose once more, carrying her words into the rafters, cementing her triumph as something that could not be undone. As she left the stage, award in hand, Evelyn felt the warmth of the spotlight linger even as it dimmed. She no longer trembled. The applause still echoed in her ears, louder than any criticism she had endured, drowning out decades of silence from those who should have clapped first. And somewhere across town, in the quiet of a living room where regret now pooled like spilled scotch, her family watched powerless as the daughter they had deemed invisible stood visible before the entire world. The applause for Evelyn had scarcely faded when the master of ceremonies returned to the stage, his voice filled with the polished enthusiasm of someone eager to keep the evening's momentum alive. And now, he declared, "Please join me in welcoming a familiar face, a gifted pianist who has graced many stages across the country, Sophia Carter." The name rippled through the room, a few polite claps following, though nothing near the thunder that had greeted Evelyn. Still, Sophia emerged from the wings, her gown shimmering under the chandeliers. Her chin lifted as though she intended to seize the spotlight her sister had just commanded. She gave a delicate wave before settling at the grand piano that gleamed at the edge of the stage, its polished surface reflecting the glitter of the gala lights. Evelyn, seated at her table with the award still resting in her lap, felt her stomach twist. She knew her sister well enough to recognize the desperation behind the graceful facade. Sophia had not been scheduled to perform tonight, but clearly she had secured a spot, perhaps leveraging connections or leaning on the Carter family's reputation. It was a move Evelyn had anticipated in some way. Her sister could never stand aside while someone else held the center of attention. Yet watching it unfold before her, Evelyn felt a pang of something between pity and resignation. The room filled with donors, politicians, and the press was not a forgiving audience. This was no family recital where excuses could be made. Sophia adjusted the sheet music before her, though her fingers trembled faintly on the ivory keys. She began with a bold flourish, a dramatic opening that drew the audience's attention. For a moment, it seemed she might pull it off her hands, moving with practiced familiarity. But as the piece progressed, cracks began to show. A note slipped here, another stumbled there, the timing faltering as nerves tightened her movements. The elegant melody fractured into uneven chords, and whispers began to spread across the room. Evelyn's chest tightened as she watched her sister's face pale, her jaw clench against the mistakes piling atop one another. Sophia pressed harder, trying to drown out the errors with volume, but the effort only made them more glaring. The once polished notes turned jagged, the rhythm collapsing entirely as she lost her place. A harsh chord rang out discordant and sharp, echoing through the hall like a slap. The audience winced collectively, some exchanging glances, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A man near the front shook his head, muttering something to his companion. The polite veneer began to crumble and murmurs of disapproval grew louder. "She's not prepared," someone whispered. "What a shame," another sighed. The press cameras, merciless as always, zoomed in to capture her faltering hands and the strain etched across her face. Sophia tried again to recover her fingers, scrambling over the keys, but the harder she fought, the worse it became. The music was gone now, replaced by a desperate attempt to claw back dignity. Then, in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, her hand slipped entirely, producing a sound so harsh that the audience collectively gasped. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, before the whispers resumed, sharper now. Sophia froze, her shoulders stiff, her chest rising and falling rapidly. And then, in front of hundreds of eyes and the relentless gaze of national broadcast cameras, she broke. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she sat paralyzed at the piano. Her hands fell into her lap, trembling, her gaze fixed downward as though she wished the stage would swallow her whole. The contrast was devastating. Only minutes before, Evelyn had stood on the same stage, bathed in applause, the embodiment of grace and accomplishment. Now her sister sat crumpled under the spotlight, the golden child stripped bare in front of strangers. The very light that had elevated Evelyn now exposed Sophia's collapse, the symbolism unmistakable. Evelyn's triumph and Sophia's breakdown had become a single narrative broadcast to the world. Across the ballroom, Evelyn caught sight of Daniel watching the scene with a measured expression, his hand resting reassuringly near hers, as though reminding her she need not intervene. This was not her battle to fight, not her humiliation to soften. The years of imbalance, the decades of favoritism had led them both here, and tonight the scales had tipped. In the Carter family's living room, the scene played out in agonizing clarity on the television screen. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, her tears renewed, but this time not from guilt alone, now from the sting of watching her favored child falter. Robert's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed his shock, his long-held pride unraveling with each discordant note. Sophia, their star, the daughter upon whom they had hung their reputation, had crumbled in front of a national audience, and Evelyn, the daughter they had dismissed, had soared. Back in the ballroom, the master of ceremonies stepped forward quickly, his polished smile returning as he guided Sophia off stage with gentle words meant to smooth the disaster. The audience offered a smattering of polite applause, more pity than praise, but the damage was done. Sophia's tears glistened under the lights as she disappeared into the wings, her breakdown captured on countless cameras etched into memory. Evelyn sat still, her award heavy in her lap, the glow of her victory made sharper by the painful collapse of the sister who had always overshadowed her. She did not gloat, did not smile, but deep within she felt the undeniable weight of vindication. Tonight the world had seen the truth. One sister's star had fallen, and the others had risen higher than ever before. After the gala ended, and the headlines the next morning blazed with Evelyn's triumph and Sophia's humiliation, Evelyn returned to her office, determined to dive back into work. She preferred blueprints to gossip columns, steel and glass to whispers of family drama. Yet fate had one more revelation waiting. Her assistant entered quietly, carrying a thick envelope marked confidential. "This came through the foundation files," he explained. "It's related to one of Daniel's educational endowments." Curious, Evelyn opened it. Inside was a copy of an old scholarship agreement signed nearly a decade earlier. The recipient, Sophia Carter, the benefactor, one of Daniel's corporate scholarships. and the signature at the bottom acknowledging receipt Margaret Carter. Evelyn's eyes lingered on the details, her chest tightening as realization struck. Sophia's much-lauded European piano studies, the years Margaret had paraded as proof of her daughter's brilliance and independence, had been funded not by family sacrifice or Sophia's supposed merit alone, but by Daniel's generosity. Her mother had known. She had accepted the help quietly and then built a story of self-reliance around Sophia while Evelyn was left to believe she was lesser, undeserving, invisible. The hypocrisy was staggering. For years, Margaret had looked her in the eye, praising Sophia's determination, contrasting it with Evelyn's supposed shortcomings, while hiding the truth that even Sophia's path had been paved with someone else's money. That evening, Evelyn sat in her apartment, the city lights glowing beyond the windows, and dialed her mother's number. The phone rang twice before Margaret answered, her voice soft, tentative. Evelyn's tone was steady, sharper than her mother had likely expected. I came across something today. A scholarship agreement. Daniel's foundation funded Sophia's studies in Europe. Your signature is on it. Silence filled the line, thick and telling. Margaret inhaled shakily. I didn't think you'd ever know about that. It was an opportunity for Sophia, and Daniel was kind enough. Evelyn cut her off. No, don't spin this. You took his help and then you lied. You paraded Sophia as though she climbed every step herself while you let me believe I was inadequate. You let me feel small in comparison when the truth is she was lifted by support you never even admitted existed. Margaret's voice broke her words, stumbling. I thought I was protecting her image, protecting the family. People expected her to be exceptional, and I wanted her to seem. Evelyn's laugh was bitter, cutting. Exceptional. At what cost? Mother, you built Sophia up on a pedestal of lies and let me rot in the shadows. And all the while you told me I wasn't enough. Her mother's sobs crackled through the receiver, a sound Evelyn had rarely heard, but they carried no balm now. Evelyn, please. I only ever wanted what was best for both of you. Evelyn closed her eyes, her jaw tight. No, you wanted what was best for Sophia. I was convenient to forget. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by Margaret's uneven breathing. At last, Evelyn spoke again, her voice lower, calmer, but edged with finality. You owe me a lot, Mother. An explanation. An apology. Years of acknowledgement you never gave. But I don't need it anymore. I don't need anything from you. There was a pause. Then Evelyn delivered the words that sealed the moment. You owe me an apology, but I don't need it. Not now, not ever. I know who I am, and I don't need you to confirm it. On the other end of the line, Margaret tried to form words, but they collapsed into quiet weeping. Evelyn listened for a moment, then ended the call. She placed the phone on the table beside her and stared out at the city skyline, the glass towers gleaming like her own triumphs. For the first time, the old longing for her mother's recognition was gone, replaced by something stronger. Freedom. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon, tucked into a plain white envelope with her parents' handwriting scrawled across the front. Evelyn recognized it instantly. For a long while she simply stared at it, her thumb running over the creases, reluctant to open what she already knew would be an apology of sorts. After her discovery of Margaret's secret and the conversation that had followed, she had not expected silence, but she had not expected this either. Slowly, carefully, she tore the flap open and drew out several folded pages. The handwriting inside was Robert's, blunt and heavy, though Margaret's voice echoed in the softer phrases scattered between. We were wrong, the letter began. We see that now. For years we told ourselves we were fair, that we loved both of our daughters equally. But the truth is, we favored Sophia. We celebrated her and overlooked you. We excused it by telling ourselves you didn't need us, that you were strong enough on your own. But that was a lie. It was easier to lean on Sophia's successes than to face our failures with you. We failed you, Evelyn, and for that we are sorry. Evelyn's eyes moved down the page, her chest tightening. The words she had longed to hear as a child, as a teenager, even as a young woman desperate for acknowledgement, were here in ink at last. Yet reading them now, they landed differently. She remembered the birthdays that passed with no celebration, the graduations where her seat remained empty of cheering parents, the times she held her accomplishments out like an offering only to have them brushed aside. She remembered the sharp sting of being told her wedding was a disgrace, the image of her family smiling on a yacht while she stood alone in her gown. No letter, no matter how carefully worded, could erase those years. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the first page aside and unfolded the second. Margaret's handwriting filled the lines this time, smaller, almost delicate. "We were blind," it read. "We convinced ourselves that what we gave to Sophia was deserved, and what we withheld from you was harmless. It was not. We see now the damage, the distance we created. Please believe us when we say we regret it deeply. We love you. We always did. We just failed to show it." The plea hung on the page, fragile and insistent, but Evelyn felt no answering rush of relief. Instead, she felt a quiet heaviness, a sorrow not for herself, but for the years wasted in lies and neglect. She carried the letter to the balcony, stepping out into the cool evening air. The city stretched before her, alive with light and motion, each tower a monument to ambition, each street a river of possibility. The hum of life below contrasted sharply with the silence that had marked so much of her past. She held the pages in her hand, the words of apology trembling in the breeze. For a moment she imagined what it would have been like to receive them when she was a child, when she had sat alone in her room listening to Sophia's parties echo down the hall. She imagined how desperately she would have clung to them then, how they might have shaped her differently. But she was not that child anymore. The Evelyn standing on this balcony was a woman who had built her own life, who had been honored before the nation, who had finally been seen not because her family granted her recognition, but because she claimed it herself. She realized with startling clarity that whether or not she forgave them was irrelevant. Forgiveness would not change the past, nor did it define her future. Their apology was a reflection of their conscience, not a salve for her wounds. She did not need their remorse to validate her worth. The breeze tugged at her hair, and she looked down at the letter one final time. She could hear Margaret's voice in her mind trembling with guilt, Robert's silence heavy with regret. They had admitted their favoritism at last, but the power it once held over her was gone. She folded the pages neatly and set them on the balcony rail, her fingers lingering for a moment before letting them rest there. She turned her gaze outward across the city's skyline, the towers glowing against the dusk. A calmness settled over her as she whispered to herself, "It doesn't matter anymore." The choice was clear. Forgiveness or not, reconciliation or not, none of it defined her. She had already escaped the prison of invisibility they had built around her. She had stepped into her own light, and no letter, no apology, no confession could take that away. The city shimmered before her, vast and unyielding, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn felt wholly free. The anniversary of the gala arrived almost without Evelyn noticing. A year had passed since she had stood in front of hundreds of people, her name spoken with reverence, her work celebrated as transformative. 12 months of new projects, magazine features, speaking invitations, and quiet evenings spent with Daniel in the apartment they had made into a sanctuary. Her life had filled itself with a rhythm that was hers alone, free of the shadow her family had cast for so long. She no longer woke with the old ache in her chest, the ache of wanting their approval. She had learned to breathe without it, to thrive without it. Yet fate has a way of circling back. On a late summer morning, while reviewing blueprints spread across her desk, her phone buzzed with a message in the old family group chat. She rarely opened it anymore, but something compelled her to look this time. The message was short, almost hesitant. From her father's number written in both his and her mother's hand. "We're proud of you." 4 simple words, years too late. Years drowned under the weight of neglect and favoritism. She stared at the screen, her lips curving not in disbelief, but in a quiet, knowing smile. Once those words would have undone her. They would have filled her with tears, with relief, with desperate gratitude. She would have clung to them like a starving child offered bread. But that was another Evelyn. The woman reading them now was whole without them. She saw the message for what it was: not redemption, but recognition, born of guilt, regret, and perhaps envy. They were proud now because the world was proud of her. They spoke it now because silence had finally become impossible. She leaned back in her chair, letting the morning light spill across her face. For a long moment she considered what to reply. The Evelyn of old would have typed a trembling thank you, eager to show she was still their daughter, still willing to forgive. Another version of her might have written a sharp retort, cataloging every wound and betrayal. But neither path tempted her now. Instead, she opened the message window, scrolled to the row of reactions, and pressed the laughing face. A simple, ha-ha, bright light final. The emoji blinked back at her on the screen, small but powerful. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a casual reply, a gesture of humor. But to Evelyn, it was the sharpest blade she could wield. Not cruel, not vulgar, but cutting in its simplicity. It said everything without saying anything at all. It was not just a dismissal of their message, not just mockery of their sudden pride. It was the emblem of her freedom. The day she no longer needed their approval, she had won. The ha-ha was not spite, it was liberation. She set the phone down, her smile lingering as she returned her gaze to the blueprints before her. The lines and shapes she had drawn stretched across the page, visions of buildings yet to rise, of spaces yet to hold life and memory. This was her world, her legacy built not on the Carter family's approval, but on her own relentless talent and will. Behind her, Daniel stepped into the room. Coffee in hand, his presence a reminder of love that had never been conditional. He bent to kiss her temple, his voice warm. "You look pleased with yourself." "I am," Evelyn replied, her tone light. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. The past had no hold on her anymore, and its ghosts no longer required naming. She picked up her pencil and bent once more over the plans, her mind already moving forward, not back. Outside the window, the city pulsed with life, the same city that had once been a backdrop to her invisibility, but now stood as her stage. Somewhere across town, her parents likely stared at the laughing emoji, their pride curdled by the realization that they no longer held power over her. But that was no longer her concern. She had answered them not with anger, not with longing, but with a symbol that said everything she had moved on, and she was untouchable. The sweetest revenge was not the national broadcast of her wedding, nor the gala, nor Sophia's breakdown. It was this moment, this quiet morning, this unshakable peace, this simple ha-ha that drew a line under the past. Evelyn Carter had freed herself, and no amount of belated pride could bind her again. And that, my friends, is how Evelyn Carter turned humiliation into triumph, how the forgotten daughter of a proud and selfish family rose to a place they could no longer reach. She did not need their belated approval, their apologies, or their pride. Her sweetest revenge was freedom itself, the power to smile, to move forward, and to never again let their neglect define her. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if your family treated you the way Evelyn's treated her? Would you have answered that final text differently? Or do you believe that simple ha-ha said it all? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter here. If you found yourself hooked by Evelyn's journey, if you felt that same mix of anger, sorrow, and satisfaction as the truth unfolded, then don't forget to subscribe. We bring you more stories of drama, betrayal, and revenge stories that will make your heart race and keep you thinking long after the video ends. Hit that button, join this community, and let's keep these conversations alive. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud, they're quiet, personal, and undeniable. Just like Evelyn's.